I'm Ginny Sloan. I'm president of the Constitution Project. The Constitution Project, as many of you know, is a national watchdog group that advances bipartisan and consensus-based solutions to some of the most difficult constitutional challenges of our time. Since our founding in 1997, we've become known for bringing together independent groups of policy experts and legal practitioners from across the political and ideological spectrums to issue consensus reports and recommendations that, on a wide variety of matters, safeguard our nation's founding charter. And you can pick up a copy of our brochure at the table up front to learn more about us. Our Task Force on Detainee Treatment follows this successful model. It is made up of former high-ranking officials with distinguished careers in the judiciary and in Congress, the diplomatic service, law enforcement, the military, and other parts of the executive branch, as well as recognized experts in law, medicine, and ethics. The group includes conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats, and you can find their biographical information in the press kit and in the report itself. The Constitution Project is enormously grateful to the members of the task force for their diligence, dedication, time, and courage. They all contributed their remarkable expertise and staked their considerable personal and professional reputations to produce this report. I also want to thank the staff that guided the task force, which was extraordinarily diligent, meticulous, and hardworking. The American public owes both the task force members and the staff a debt of gratitude. 8 of the 11 members of the task force are here today, as is Neil Lewis, the task force's wonderful executive director. I'm pleased to introduce one of the group's co-chairs, Ambassador James Jones, who will begin the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for the introduction. Let me first say that personally and on behalf of the task force members, I want to express our sympathy and our solidarity with the people of Boston on yesterday's tragic activity. It once again demonstrates that we who live in the freest and most open democracy in the world, that we sometimes have to pay for that. Last night I saw an interview of a 78-year-old runner who was the first one to be hit by the bomb, and he was interviewed later. And one of the questions they asked him, does this mean that you probably will not run in this race again? He said, absolutely not. I'll be here, and I'm not going to let those people run me off. So that is the attitude of Americans when this kind of tragedy hits. It's our resilience, and we found that to be true in some of our deliberations on this task force. What distinguishes the United States and makes us the envy of the world is our adherence to common values. And one of those most important values is respect and adherence to a rule of law. And what we tried to do in this report was to point out where we separated ourselves in our official actions from those values and how we must get back on track. This week marks the 25th anniversary of President Reagan signing the United Nations Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment or Punishment. In his message to the Senate, President Reagan said that ratification of the convention, quote, will clearly express the United States' opposition to torture, an abhorrent practice unfortunately still prevalent in the world today. Little could he have known at the time that America would itself engage in this abhorrent practice, particularly in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of September 2001. The Constitution's Project Task Force, as Jenny said, was broadly based, was bipartisan, had all political philosophies covered. We had expertise in all of the realms, professional realms that were needed to study this issue. The project was undertaken with the belief that it was important to provide an account as authoritatively and accurately as we could, so that how the United States treated people that were held in its custody, which was mobilized to deal with a global terrorist threat. On taking office, President Obama declined to undertake an official study of what happened. Senator Leahy introduced legislation to establish a Truth Commission, and Congress failed to act on it. So in many respects, this task force, this report, is the comprehensive examination of the treatment of suspected terrorists that official Washington has been reluctant to conduct. Task force members believe that having an understanding of what occurred during this period of serious threat and a willingness to acknowledge any shortcomings strengthen the nation and equips us to better cope with any future crises. Ignoring what happened, our reputation as an exemplary practitioner of the rule of law will clearly be damaged. The task force is made up of, as Jenny said, of a broad cross-section of folks who have been in government, who understand military, who understand the role of intelligence. The bios are in your folder, but I would like to take just a minute to introduce them at this time. Dr. Gerald Thompson, the professor emeritus at Columbia University School of Medicine. Richard Epstein is the professor of law at New York University and the University of Chicago. Dr. David Gushee, professor of Christian ethics and writer of so many books, I could not possibly read them all, of Mercer University, but truly an authority and expert in the area of ethics. Dr. Aziza Al-Ibri, the professor emerita at the University of Richmond School of Law. General David Irvine, who had a distinguished career in intelligence in the military as a brigadier general, was a 4-term Republican legislator from Utah, and currently practices law in Salt Lake City. And Tom Pickering, who is perhaps in our history one of the most distinguished ambassadors and diplomats we've ever had, having been an ambassador 7 times and undersecretary of state. We were aided by tremendous staff, headed by our executive director, Nick Lewis, who has already been recognized, a former New York Times reporter. Also on the staff was Captain Kent Eiler, counsel Jacob Gillig, administrator Catherine Hawkins, investigator, and Alka Pradham, a counsel. Also, we were aided at key times by Adam Clymer, another former New York Times journalist. And their bios are also in the packet. This study encompasses a vast amount of information, a result of more than 2 years of research, analysis, and deliberation. It is based on a thorough examination of available public records and interviews with more than 100 people, including former detainees, military and intelligence officers, interrogators, and policymakers. The task force staff and members conducted on-the-ground fact-finding in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Lithuania, Poland, and the United Kingdom, and also at Guantanamo Bay. Although we don't have subpoena power or access to classified information, we believe that this report is the most comprehensive record of detainee treatment across multiple administrations and multiple geographic theaters that's been published to date. We also have a dedicated website which went live this morning that has additional supporting information. So at this time, having set the stage for this, I'd like to turn over to the co-chairman of this task force, the former Republican congressman from Arkansas, the former undersecretary of the Department of Homeland Security in President George W. Bush's administration, and someone who added great wisdom and great knowledge to the deliberations of the task force, Asa Hutchinson.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for your leadership on the task force. And I want to express my thanks to the Constitution Project, but also to all of my fellow task force members, what they brought to the table in terms of experience, wisdom, public service, really made a difference in the development of this project and important report. As Jim mentioned, there's more than 24 findings and recommendations. We can't cover all of those this morning, but we do want to hit some of the highlights. We hope you'll take the entire report, study it through, and look at each of those recommendations. Why is this report important? It's important because we as a nation have to get this right. I look back in history to the time during World War II that we interned some Japanese Americans. At the time, it seemed like the right and proper thing to do. But in the light of history, it was an error. And so today, this report will hopefully put into focus some of the actions taken in the post-9/11 environment. There are some key questions we wanted to address this morning. One, did the treatment of suspected terrorists in U.S. custody rise the level of torture? Secondly, if so, how did this happen? And then what can we learn from this to make better decisions in the future? On the first question, we found that U.S. personnel in many instances used interrogation techniques on detainees that constitute torture. American personnel conducted an even larger number of interrogations that involved cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment. Both categories of actions violate U.S. laws and international treaty obligations. This conclusion is not based upon our own personal impressions, but rather is grounded in a thorough and detailed examination of what constitutes torture from a historical and legal context. We looked at court cases and determined that the treatment of detainees in many instances met the standards the courts have determined as constituting torture. But in addition, you look at the United States State Department in its annual country reports on human rights practices has characterized many of the techniques used against detainees in U.S. custody in the post-9/11 environment. The State Department has characterized the same treatment as torture, abuse, or cruel treatment when those techniques were employed by foreign governments. The CIA recognized this in an internal review and acknowledged that many of the interrogation techniques it employed were inconsistent with the public policy positions the United States has taken regarding human rights. The United States is understandably subject to criticism when it criticizes another nation for engaging in torture and then justifies the same conduct under national security arguments. There are those that defend the techniques of like waterboarding, stress positions, and sleep deprivation because there was the Office of Legal Counsel which issued a decision approving of their use because they defined them as not being torture. Those opinions have since been repudiated by legal experts and the OLC itself. And even in its opinion, it relied not only on a very narrow legal definition of torture, but also on factual representations about how the techniques would be implemented that later proved inaccurate. This is an important context as to how the opinion came about, but also as to how policymakers relied upon it. Based upon a thorough review of the available public record, we determined that in application, torture was used against detainees in many instances and across a wide range of theaters. On the question of responsibility, or how did this happen, any effort to understand how the government decided to approve the torture of detainees must begin with a recognition of the fear and anxiety that enveloped our country after 9/11. We have a small taste of this today, even after the events yesterday in Boston, and the desire of first responders and law enforcement and the public to know the perpetrators of this incredible act of violence. The intensity was even much greater post 9/11 because of the incredible loss of life. And the greatest concerns of Americans and their leaders in that period were simply preventing further attacks. Task force members understand clearly that those officials whose decisions may have contributed to the use of torture undertook those measures as their best efforts to protect their fellow citizens. And while our report is critical of the approval of interrogation techniques that ultimately led to U.S. personnel engaging in torture of detainees, the investigation was not an undertaking of partisan fault-finding. Our conclusions about responsibility should be taken very simply as an effort to understand what happened at many levels of the U.S. policy making. There is no way of knowing how the government would have responded if a Democrat administration were in power at the time of the attacks. Indeed, our report is equally critical of the rendition to torture program which began under President Clinton, and we question several actions of the current administration as well. It should be noted that many of the corrective actions that were first undertaken during the Bush administration as well. But the task force did conclude that the nation's highest officials, after the 9/11 attack, approved actions for CIA and defense personnel based upon legal guidance that has since been repudiated. The most important decision may have been to declare the Geneva Convention did not apply to al-Qaeda and Taliban captives in Afghanistan or Guantanamo. The administration never specified what rules would apply instead. The task force believes that U.S. defense intelligence professionals and service members in harm's way need absolutely clear orders on the treatment of detainees, requiring at a minimum compliance with Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention. This was not done. Civilian leaders and military commanders have an affirmative responsibility to ensure that their subordinates comply with the laws of war. President Obama has committed to observe the Geneva Conventions through an executive order, but a future president could change it by the stroke of a pen. Congress, one of our recommendations, needs to work with the administration to strengthen the torture statute, the War Crimes Act, and the Uniform Code of Military Justice to remove the loopholes that allowed torture to occur. In terms of the CIA, we did not have access to classified information. This is the reason we're asking the administration to review much of the classified information to see what can be released without compromising national security and to provide more transparency and light on how the policy decisions were made. Dr. David Gushee would be happy to answer questions when we conclude about the responsibility and how the absence of clear standards left troops on the front line in an untenable position. On the question of effectiveness of torture, there is no persuasive evidence in the public record that the widespread use of torture against suspected terrorists was necessary. That is, that it produced significant information of value that could not have been otherwise obtained. I'll just simply make 2 points and observations in this regard. The task force believes it is important to recognize that to say torture is ineffective does not require a demonstration that it never works. A person subjected to torture might well divulge useful information, nor does the fact that it may sometimes yield legitimate information justify its use. What values do America stand for? That's the ultimate question. But in addition to the very real legal and moral objections to its use, torture often produces false information, and it is difficult and time-consuming for interrogators and analysts to distinguish what may be true and usable from that which is false and misleading. Also, conventional lawful interrogation methods have proven to be successful whenever the United States uses them throughout history, and I've seen this in law enforcement as well. We've seen no evidence in the public record that the traditional means of interrogation would not have yielded the necessary intelligence following the attacks of 9/11. General David Irvine, who taught prisoner of war interrogation for 18 years at the 6th Army Intelligence School, was on the task force, and will be happy to answer questions about the effectiveness of torture. Those are a couple of the key findings, but there are many more findings in the task force report that I hope that you will review. This has been an important task that we have engaged in, but we understand how difficult it is for a nation to come to terms with what these findings are and these recommendations. We hope that we will learn from these and improve policy-making decisions in the future. And with that, I'll turn it back to my co-chair for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Asa. They've asked me to highlight just a few other things in the report and to identify some of our task force members to whom you might want to ask questions. The effects and the consequences. The report looks at the impact of our actions on our relationship with other governments in the world. Of special interest is the Extraordinary Rendition Program. After September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks, the Bush administration resolved to use every available means to protect the United States from further attack. This Extraordinary Rendition Program, used previously by President Clinton, quickly became an important tool in that effort. And in the years since, numerous investigations and inquiries have found evidence of illegal acts in the form of arbitrary detention and torture resulting from the program. These need to be reviewed. We found an investigation of extraordinary rendition by the task force. They uncovered many new details regarding the black sites in Poland and Lithuania. In Poland, an official investigation has been hampered by the U.S. government's refusal to provide any and share any information, even as the Polish prosecutors have issued indictments against Polish officials for their role in facilitating the black sites. In Lithuania, prosecutors faced many of the same problems of not being able to get information shared with them from the United States government. And in that particular case, they closed the investigation in 2011. And while they admit that there were black sites there, they have no evidence of what prisoners were detained there. There have been a number of inquiries into the rendition program in the United Kingdom, including one by the House of Commons and one by the All-Party Parliamentary Group headed by a Conservative MP, Andrew Tyree. The task force will actually present our findings to them in June. And due to the growing legal and political consequences of the CIA's rendition program and network of secret prisons, and the fact that officials credibly assert that both programs have been discontinued, the task force recommends that the United States fully comply with its legal obligations under the Convention Against Torture, and in cooperating with the pending investigations around the world and these lawsuits. President Obama's early executive order also closed the CIA's black sites, but their effect on the CIA's rendition of detainees to foreign custody is less clear. So therefore, the task force makes specific recommendations of ways to strengthen the process of rules on those renditions and the process of diplomatic assurances from those countries to which they are rendered. Ambassador Tom Pickering can answer the questions that you have in this particular area, the international and the diplomatic issues that we discuss. We also looked at the effect of our actions on former detainees. Detainees are not traditionally an object of sympathy, and yet many of these detainees who were found not to be guilty of anything that even though they did not have a trial, were released, and released virtually with no assistance, no help, no way to get back into the world. This is an issue that I think is of importance, and Dr. Aziza Alibri can answer questions with regard to those. A few words on the medical and the legal profession in this effort. Medical professionals, including physicians and psychologists, participated variously in interrogations. Rules and regulations and operating procedures were altered to guide physicians in their involvement in detention and interrogation procedures that put many of them in direct conflict with their professional ethics. We offer several recommendations to preclude this in the future. We have, as I think Asa mentioned, the force feeding part, and that is where the military acknowledges that there were 28, I think it's a little higher as of today, detainees at Guantanamo that are conducting a hunger strike, 10 of whom are being force-fed. The press reports that some lawyers of other detainees report that the hunger strike is much more widespread, involving a majority of the 166 men still held there, and that some have lost significant weight in recent weeks. Again, this is a medical issue that I would suggest you direct your questions to Dr. Jerry Thompson. On the legal front, one of the things we found was that this was a war conducted less by the generals and more by the lawyers. The lawyers also that played a very key role. In the aftermath of the attacks, lawyers in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel provided legal advice that seemed to go to great lengths to allow treatment that amounted to torture. The report offers a systematic examination of the ways of legal interpretations evolved in response to the court decisions and public pressure. The role of the OLC in the federal government is unique. It is the president's law firm, and they have a responsibility to push back against unreasonable institutional pressures from the White House or anywhere in government. The task force recommends that the OLC should periodically review confidential opinions to determine if they may be declassified and released. If opinions from the OLC might someday be disclosed, the OLC attorneys would be more mindful of their responsibility and to act in an impartial manner and less likely to engage in advocacy. And Professor Richard Epstein is available to answer those questions. On the issue of the Obama administration, during the 2008 campaign, President Obama criticized the Bush administration's treatment of detainees. Candidate Obama promised to close Guantanamo and to reject torture without exception or equivocation. He also criticized the previous administration for executive secrecy, including repeated invocation of the state secrets privilege to get civil lawsuits thrown out of court, and he promised to lead a new era of openness. The administration has fulfilled some of those promises and conspicuously failed to fulfill others, in some cases because Congress has blocked them, but in other cases for reasons of their own. As Asa mentioned earlier, a high level of secrecy surrounding the rendition and torture of detainees since September 11 cannot continue to be justified on the basis of national security. The authorized enhanced techniques have been publicly disclosed, and the CIA has approved its former employees' publication of detailed accounts of individual interrogation. Ongoing classification of material documenting these practices serves only to conceal evidence of wrongdoing and to make its repetition more likely. Apart from redactions needed to protect specific individuals and to honor specific diplomatic agreements, the task force urges the President to direct executive branch agencies to promptly and fully declassify as much material about the treatment of suspected terrorists as possible. The Convention Against Torture, to which the United States is a signatory, in addition is prohibiting all acts of torture. In addition to prohibiting all acts of torture, requires that states ensure in their legal system that the victim of an act of torture obtains redress and has an enforceable right to fair and adequate compensation. The United States has not complied with this requirement. The task force recommends that the state secrets privilege should be subjected to independent judicial review and restrict the use of the privilege to cases where it is truly necessary to guard against non-speculative harms to national security. As Asa mentioned, we have 24 findings and specific recommendations, both for the legislative and the executive to act on. We urge you to read the report. We think it's readable as opposed to just a dry set of words. And now let's close and open it up for questions. First of all, let me say that because we're trying to get the website and others to be able to understand the question, after you raise your hand, identify yourself, and then wait for a microphone to come to you. We have 2 microphones on both sides of the room. So thank you for listening to our summation of the report. Who has a question? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, and thank you for doing this. Camille El Hassani from Al Jazeera English Television. I have 2 questions. One, you mentioned it a little bit about the force feeding of some hunger striking detainees at Guantanamo. I wondered if you could talk, if the doctor could talk a little bit more about what the long-term impact of that is, and if what can we see? I mean, how can this situation be resolved? And then that leads to my second question for the both of you about political will to do what the administration has said is its intended goal of closing the facility and and due process for as many of the detainees as they can put on trial. It seems there's no will on either side, and they're just blaming Congress is blaming the White House, and the White House is blaming Congress. What can be done to move both of these issues forward?
The long-term impact can be seen, I think, in 2 ways. One, the potential impact on the detainees in terms of success, in terms of personal risk and injury. And second, what is going to be the impact politically on the situation at Guantanamo? You know that the task force came out very strongly condemning force feeding. And this is in keeping and in line with international ethical standards, both of professional treatment of hunger strikers and the ethics of treating hunger strikers. We do not believe that force feeding should be an approach to the hunger strike. If you can imagine being a detainee and using refusal to eat as a form of protest, and then you are forced to eat, forced physically to eat by being strapped into a specially made chair and restrained, having restraints put on your limbs, your arms, your legs, your body, your head, so you cannot move, having a tube inserted into your throat that extends into your stomach, and you're trying to resist that with the only muscles that are free in your throat. Pain, discomfort, obviously. But in addition to that, food is then forced in a liquid form into your stomach. You're kept in the chair for at least 2 hours, usually more than 2 hours, to prevent you from vomiting and undermining the force feeding. You can't go to the bathroom during that time. Your dignity is taken away. The World Medical Association and international officials have clearly identified that process as cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And given the level of brutality, it could extend to torture. Now, since you're refusing food, that's going to happen to you twice a day after day, month and week after week. And for some detainees, it has gone on for years, as much as 4 years and longer. Now, no question that that has great risk to the detainee, and if the detainee is not treated properly, some damage can occur, and obviously there's always the risk of death. We worry about this hunger strike. It's not the first, as you all know, at Guantanamo Bay. Perhaps the most dramatic, most focused and extensive were in 2005, and there were two, dealing with conditions of the detention camp and beginning to come to grips on part of the detainees with the extended detention, the hope of getting out of Guantanamo Bay. The first part of that 2005 ended because the detainees thought there was going to be application of Geneva Conventions, and they were in discussions. When that didn't happen, they had the second hunger strike, and it was during that hunger strike that the restraint chairs and the force feeding in restraint chairs was introduced. This now is a hunger strike occurring with very different circumstances. The last hunger strike seemed to have been broken by the use of the force feeding, partly, because the numbers dropped off dramatically during the force feeding. In addition, you have to believe that there was some hope in association with that the detainees saw in addition to the force feeding. This time we're dealing with force feeding and hunger strikers who may have much, much less hope. In fact, the reason for the hunger strike is an absence of hope. So we're concerned, first of all, that force feeding is being used. Second, we don't have a lot of transparency about how that's being done. And third, it's very hard to see how we're going to have a reasonable outcome here without some sort of intervention.
When you ask the second part of the question, when will the political will come about with Congress blaming the administration blaming Congress? Before you got to Guantanamo Bay, I thought of budget, gun control, immigration. That seems to be prevalent in Washington these days. I would point out that we had a unanimous agreement on all parts of our report, with one exception, and it's part of of our report, and that was on what to do with the Guantanamo prisoners, which are the minority of those who are there now, who have not been tried and who, for various reasons of evidence being tainted or whatever, probably will not be tried. And that's where we had some disagreement and had a minority opinion. I might ask Ambassador Tom Pickering, however, who was very outspoken on this particular issue, to comment on this and on her question of the political will.
Thank you very much, Jim. If I knew the answer on political will, I suppose there would be more prophetic qualities to my history. One hopes that we will see it. One hopes that we will see immigration and gun control and other efforts. I spent my life as a diplomat and spent a good part of that life trying to importune other governments to live up to the rule of law. I was chagrined, embarrassed, and indeed in many ways felt undermined by the notion that our country, which instructed me on numerous occasions to uphold the rule of law, particularly indefinite detention without trial, was something that we now practice and continue to practice, despite all of the questions that people tend to try to raise about a war and prisoners of war and all of the rest. My sense is that we need a specific way forward. The report contains recommendations on a specific way forward. Simply trial or military commission with rights and privileges equal to our Article 3 court system. If that won't work, then various ways of deportation. And in the end, if that won't work, at least moving the prisoners to the United States and retaining them in the system which the immigration statute provides for ultimate deportation with regular reviews. This is not a perfect answer, but it does, in many ways, address the question of the symbolism of Guantanamo, which I think is now an unfortunate blot on the record of the United States with respect to the use of the rule of law and indeed to the question of indefinite detention without trial. We also recommend that in parallel with the position that occurred when our forces left Iraq, when the major effort is terminated in 2014, there be, in fact, a public statement declaration of the termination of any application of the thought that there is a wartime situation continuing with respect, in particular, to these detainees. And I think from my earlier remarks, you will understand the importance of that.
Richard, you?
Yeah, there were two dissenters to some of this, Asa and myself, and let me see if I could sort of identify what the sources of differences are. First of all, none of them relate to the question of what had happened and how it could be avoided. I think all of us believe that one of the most dangerous findings is that people in good faith can do terrible things because authority tends to erode and to slip. And as you go further and further down the chain, what happens is there's a greater and greater departure from the things that were contemplated above. But as a kind of a professional lawyer, remedial side is always extremely difficult to deal with, even though there's very strong agreement with respect to what is wrong under these cases. So on Guantanamo, the terrible question is compared to what? And if the what turns out to be sending people to Bagram Air Force Base, where we are now able to do it, that would, in my mind, be an even worse outcome. The way the Supreme Court in its Boumediene case interpreted some of our authorities, it says that the kinds of treatment that all of us are in favor are only apply when you're in the territory of the United States, and shipping people to 4 remote areas may give them fewer rights and also much less assistance that they could otherwise get. On the question of the indefinite detention, I think we all agree that it's a completely nightmarish situation because we do not know when a conflict ends, and so therefore we do not know what to do in the interim. My own view is I would prefer to try some of these people. I would prefer to release some of them, but in many cases it seems that the evidence leaves you in limbo, strong enough to detain but not strong enough to try. And my own view about that is I think what was said earlier about the need for a constant system of oversight and review is important. One of the things that's wrong with the system of habeas corpus is it's a once and for all determination made at the outset of a hearing, and that's a mistake. You have to constantly upgrade based on new information. You must have constant oversight by other individuals. And the situation here is very similar to that in general surveillance, where a kind of a warrant requirement under the Fourth Amendment doesn't deal with the situation. But the thought that you should allow this stuff to go on indefinitely without periodic review by some independent authority is, in effect, I think, indefensible. So you should understand that the differences that exist on this task force with respect to remedies are on means to a common end. They are not differences that there is something about what's going on here which is more laudable than the report makes out. I mean, I think I speak for everybody when I say that the level of thoroughness that Nick Lewis and his team brought to this is second to none. And we hope that even if there's some disagreements on the remedial side, that we all agree that the report will place very powerful limits on what counts as a credible response to the difficult situations that we've faced in the past and which we must do everything in the future to avoid.
Let me also just a brief mention on the political part of the question. There's a lot like not in my backyard for a project. In this regard, there's a strong feeling among many on both sides of the political aisle that these people, if they're brought to the United States, put in a prison, would be a danger to the United States, a security problem for the United States. That has not proven to be true in other terrorist actions. The civil courts, the federal courts, have been able to try these cases, get convictions, and I think there's something like 300 prisoners that fall under that rubric of terrorism that are in federal prisons on United States soil today, and there have been no escapes and no dangers to the society. But it's a political feeling that it could, and that's the problem. Other question? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Matt Spatalnik with Reuters News Service. A couple of questions. One to follow up on the Guantanamo issue. Again, you gentlemen were not able to reach a unanimous recommendation after 2 years of your own, I'm sure, very reasoned struggle. So what, if any, chances really are there that Congress and the administration, in any reasonable period of time, can overcome the political, legal, legislative obstacles that have been set up to closing Guantanamo by the end of 2014, as you've suggested? The other question I've got relates again to the Boston, the Boston tragedy. I think what you painted is a picture of an overreaction to 9/11 in many ways, and that the treatment of detainees in counterterrorism operations and the like. What, if any, danger might you see of an overreaction coming out of what's happened in Boston in terms of, let's say, the safety and security of public places, the kind of surveillance that is conducted domestically?
Well, on the first question, one of the reasons for giving a comprehensive report and putting it in context that you can relate to, and particularly the recommendation that as much classified material that supports or rejects what we found be released, is that will give Congress and the political forces a clearer picture of what really did exist and what exists today. And based on that, we think there might be some changes of attitude with regard to Guantanamo. As far as the Boston overreaction, to me, one of the big problems of the post 9/11 was the lack of clarity in what people down the line were asked to do. And I don't think that is likely to be repeated. I think one of the things we clearly feel is necessary is a clear line of responsibilities and of what you do with those responsibilities. And hopefully that won't happen again. Does anyone else want to? Yes, sir, Tom?
I would just add, Jim, you made the point very clearly. The fact that we're holding this press conference this morning in the aftermath of a tragedy of great proportions to the country and talking about correcting the errors of overreaction should in itself, I hope, speak something to the public and to the press and indeed to those who have to make decisions. We have put in our report a kind of roadmap of how to avoid future error. And we hope that the fact that we decided to go ahead this morning, despite what would be a normal tendency to postpone, speaks to the question of can we and shouldn't we get on the record what in effect is a record of the need for corrective action and do it even in the aftermath of a national tragedy of the proportions we saw yesterday.
Richard?
Yeah, one of the things I think that we learned from this report is that the single most dangerous notion in dealing with these things is to assume that necessity allows you to excuse yourself from the observance of standard procedures. It turns out that trying to make ad hoc judgments on the spur of the moment leads to more mistakes than it avoids. And if one takes the analogy, for example, to sound medical treatment, the ability to follow protocol or standard procedures when it looks as though there are independent reasons to avoiding it is one of the things that you have to constantly stress. There is much too much evidence or willingness to sort of stress the emergency of the moment and not enough to get really clear with respect to the background procedure. So as a general matter, I think one of the things that we've said is you don't use extraordinary procedures when regular procedures are available. You don't spend your time arguing whether or not certain kinds of combatants are or not covered by the Geneva Conventions. You follow the good military advice, which is you give everybody the same trial, you get more legitimacy than not out of the situation. And on the other point, what I would stress in all of these cases is that when we had the Al-Qaeda situation in 2001, we knew it was done institutionally, and we knew that we were fighting some kind of a systemic enemy. In this particular case, the early returns suggest that it's an isolated act of a given individual, and that may well change the way in which one starts to think about how one treats this thing going forward in terms of national security and similar issues. And a lot will be found out in the next 72 hours or a week as to how this thing did. And if it turns out to be a one-off situation, I think the long-term implications are obviously less than if it is not.
I concur in terms of Boston. We're still learning, obviously, and I think the first responders, the Homeland Security officials that are looking at this, the FBI, will follow protocols. I have no reason to think that there would be any overreaction or breach of normal protocols and policies that have been put into place.
Other questions? I'm going to call on General Irvine because we have had questions on the efficacy of torture as beneficial to the United States in getting information. Would you comment on that?
Well, first of all, as we approached the question of what brutal interrogation can or cannot produce, it became very quickly evident that there have been many claims made that harsh interrogation, torture, whatever you wish to call it, we have run into the euphemism frequently, enhanced interrogation techniques, that this somehow works and therefore is a justifiable means of obtaining information. In fact, it's curious that today probably more people in the United States believe that harsh interrogation, A, works, and B, ought to be used, at least in some cases where there is a particular significant threat that's involved. And one of the reasons this probably has evolved as it has is that the claims that it is effective, that it has saved tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, have largely been made in a vacuum. And as has been mentioned previously, we did not have access to classified information, particularly to the classified interrogation logs that were developed by CIA interrogators, in some instances military interrogators. Those reports are of critical importance in determining whether the claims that have been made for the effectiveness of these means of interrogation have any validity. At this point, from what we have been able to determine from the public record strongly suggests that there was no useful information gained from going to the dark side that saved the hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of lives that have been claimed. There are many instances in that public record to support the notion that we have been badly misled by false confessions that have been derived from brutal interrogations. And unfortunately, it is a fact that people will just say whatever they think needs to be said if the pain becomes more than they can bear. Other people are so immune to pain that they will die before they will reveal what an interrogator may wish to know. And so the issue of whether cruelty, whether torment, whether torture is effective is a question that we can't say in every instance is not effective, nor can we say that it is more effective than conventional means of interrogation. And this is an issue that will resolve or be resolved, hopefully, when the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence can release the details of the report that it has prepared, where those senators and staffers have actually gone into the classified record and have made an analysis based on that information. So far, the reports are that there is not much there that would suggest that this approach to interrogation has been useful. I'll just say in conclusion that in 2001, the United States had had a great deal of experience with tactical and strategic interrogations. We had been very successful over a long period of time in learning how to do this and do it very, very well. Unfortunately, when the policies were developed that led us to the dark side, many of those who were involved in formulating those policies had no experience with interrogation, had no experience with law enforcement, had no experience with the military in how these matters are approached. One of the most successful FBI interrogators prior to 2001 was a guy named Joe Navarro. And Joe is noted for having said, and he was probably one of the handful of strategic interrogators qualified to interrogate and debrief a high-value al-Qaeda prisoner. But Joe said, I only need three things. If you'll give me three things, I will get whatever someone has to say, and I will do it without breaking the law. First of all, I need a quiet room. Second, I want to know what the rules are because I don't want to get in trouble. And third, I need enough time to become that person's best and only friend. And if you give me those three conditions, I will get whatever that person has to say, and I will get it effectively and quickly and safely and within the terms of the law. So we can do it well when we want to. We need to do more looking at our history to remind us what worked and why it worked, and not resort to what may seem at the time to be expedient, clever, or necessary.
Did other questions? Did you have a hand up over here? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Thank you for the report. I have two questions. Number one, are you planning to have a briefing or a hearing on the Hill on this issue, to have a member of Congress from the Republican and Democrat to sponsor a hearing? And number two, are you planning to meet with people from administration to speak about this issue to them? And the question for Dr. Aziz Al-Hibri, how much of this issue impact the relationship of United States with the Muslim world and Arab world in terms of the image of United States?
Before, I would just mention, we have let it be known that we would be willing to testify and to brief anybody in the administration or Congress, but it's up to them to invite us. Dr. Al-Hibri?
Thank you. I'd like to first say that I have been very honored to be on this panel, and throughout those 2 years find out a lot of information that I did not know in such a great detail. It is important to me because one reason I'm in this country is because I believe in the ideals of the Constitution and of this country. And let's not mislead ourselves into thinking that everyone who comes here comes for economic reasons. There are a lot of people who come here for our values. And it is our values that we need to keep up, because that's who we are. The problem with these issues is that I'm now finding out a lot about them, as you are. But in Muslim and Arab countries, they've heard about these in some detail for quite a while now, because many of the detainees went back and talked. Many of these people, some were children, under 18, and we were found not guilty and released. And they went back, and not only did they talk to their families and to their communities, but some of them appeared on television. That is a very uncomfortable position for me, someone who's been working on human rights issues around the world for the last 30 years, to find out that we have a problem with human rights. I work very closely on issues of religious freedom. There are also some of these issues that appeared in Guantanamo and other places, as you might have heard. These bother me a great deal as an American, but you can imagine the situation abroad. And I'm very concerned that Al-Qaeda has seen an expansion. It has been able to expand its forces from being initially in Afghanistan and now going all the way to Syria and parts of Egypt and so on. And I think that the more we stand up for who we are, the more we defend our values, the more we are going to gain and give influence and force to the moderate voice in the Muslim world that believes in us.
Thank you very much. We have 3 minutes left before closing. Dr. Gushee, would you have anything you'd like to say? And I'd like to ask Nick Lewis if he had anything, because he led a terrific team. And then Asa, close it off.
Yes, thank you, Jim. The task force says in our report, all societies behave differently under stress. At those times, they may even take actions that conflict with their essential character and values. And that's what we did here. We were under stress, and we took actions that conflict with who we are called to be, and who we have committed to be. And then we spent about 10 years not being willing to face the truth about that, often by covering what happened with euphemisms and an awful lot of state secrets. So I believe that our detainee task force has functioned as a kind of truth commission, revealing where we strayed from our values by shining the light of investigation and analysis onto the problem, in the hope that the next time we're under that kind of stress, we do not go down the same road. And it has been an honor to serve on this panel.
Thank you, David. Nick, final
I have
word?
very little, just in terms of new things. Everyone here has discussed the general contours of the report, which is the most important thing. There are some new points raised in the report. There's a discussion of the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the debate inside that organization. We have an interview with the fellow who was the ICRC representative in Washington, and we also have an interview with the first commander of the detention hospital at Guantanamo, who was presented as support for the humane face of Guantanamo in the early years. He's a naval captain, equivalent of a colonel, and he now teaches at the U.S. Naval War College, Albert Shimkus, and he relates in our report how he's filled with remorse and regret and feels he was misled and used, and is very contrite about what happened and what he did not notice at the time. Thank you.
It's been a great privilege for me to co-chair such a distinguished panel, and I thank them because they were deeply involved. Asa, you want to close it off?
Likewise, Jim, it's been an honor to work with you and all the members of the task force. I would just end by saying I hope that this does mark an illustration as to how things can work well in Washington and in our nation, that a group of leaders in a bipartisan and left-right, if there is such a thing, way can work through a very thorny issue for our country, hopefully make a difference, and this will set a good path for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.
You did a great job moderating.